Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, then, what is featurality? We can call it the orthographic representation of a unit lower on the phonological hierarchy than that of the phoneme, and the term comes from Jeffrey Sampson in the 1980s. And the advantage of it is that it bequeaths a certain visual regularity to a writing system by binding together a natural class of sounds. And most would agree it doesn't warrant a separate typological class like alphabet and abjads, because no writing system is entirely featural. But there's an increasing acknowledgement that it's very present in many of the world's writing systems, and Africa is no exception. So what about Africa? We're talking about 2,000 plus languages. And there's a movement across the continent to develop orthographies for previously unwritten minority marginalized languages. And for historical reasons that I'm not going to go into, most of these are modified Roman script orthographies. I stress that I'm not talking about linguistic transcription in this paper. It's to do with functional literacy programs. So I wanted to undertake a geolinguistic survey to identify which phonological features are represented linearly and how, and the degree of systematicity in them, and any geographical tendencies. I don't make any distinction between practice and proposals, for the simple reason that actually many of the sources don't tell us whether they're practice in existing practice or proposals either. And I'm not making any attempt to assess any of the featural strategies for their effectiveness. The methodology was then a perusal of the published and unpublished literature, a lot of it locally produced, but more and more of it available online these days. Responses to an online forum that I got dozens of responses from, and also consulting Omniglot, the wonderful online database of writing systems. So the result is a survey of 180 languages in 30 countries. So I want to suggest that there's three ways we can approach featurality in a writing system. The first is what I'm terming multilinear featurality, where you have an obligatory tier of consonants and vowels, and then you add an optional superscript or subscript tier for various diacritics. And if we take the implosive series, b, d, g, which are very common in African languages, then that might be represented with a subscript dot, and that's what I'm terming a multilinear representation. And the dot represents the feature implosive. But we can come down to a more microscopic level, as many researchers often do when they're exploring featurality, to look at individual character strokes within letters. And so with that same series in the IPA, which is often those letters are borrowed for practical orthographies, we have all three sounds represented by symbols that have ascenders and hooks. So that's featural too. But I'm not focusing on either of these kinds of featurality in this paper. I'm coming to the third kind, which is what I'm terming linear featurality. And we've already seen some examples this afternoon in Urdu, where you might add, for example, a postposed letter H to signal that feature in the series. So a whole discrete letter woven into the texture of the middle tier of consonants and vowels. So let's have a look at some languages that do that. A widespread, no particular geographical tendencies. It's a very widespread feature, and it's very widely represented linearly with a postposed letter H in many different countries. Related to that, though, we have ejectives, which find a strong concentration in Ethiopia and almost always represented with a postposed apostrophe. some other countries as well. And then the interesting thing is that actually you can group implosives and ejectives together because they both involve glottal release. And therefore, a single featural strategy is perfectly justified. And there are two languages in Ethiopia that do just this. Nasal vowels, Yoruba is a good example of a language that represents nasality with a postposed letter N like the French orthography does. And in a short extract of text, you'll find it a dozen times. And this is probably the most frequently attested case of linear featurality across Africa. In dozens, if not hundreds of languages, nasal vowels are marked in this way, and equally as common in the Anglophone countries as in the Francophone countries. Now, coming to my home territory, I live in the north of Togo, and this is the language I cut my teeth on as a linguist. The Kabye language is unusual in the region for having 5 back unrounded vowels. They go something like this. And they're represented in the orthography with a postposed letter gamma. There's a good linguistic reason for that I won't go into. Now, the beauty of this is that, yes, it's a featural representation because you've got a gamma in each of the cases, but you've also got phonemic awareness because each of those digraphs represents a phoneme. And even more than that, you've got morphemic awareness because these phonemes only ever occur at the morpheme boundary. So as soon as you see a gamma, you know that you're at the position between the root and the suffix. So this is an extract from the article on tsunamis in the Kabye Wikipedia, and you see it occurs about 10 times. Let's come to tone now. In fact, tone is not represented linearly very often. It's much more a case of adding accents across the top of the script. But in Ivory Coast, there's a concentration of about 15 languages, Kru, Kwa, and Mande languages that have an extraordinarily heavy functional load of tone. In Eastern Dan, and they're largely monosyllabic as well. So in Eastern Dan, you can have 5 level tones, and these can combine in falling and rising contours in 6 different ways. So on every syllable, you've got 11 possibilities. And with the constraints of manual typewriters in the 1970s, they decided the best way to represent this was with preposed and postposed punctuation symbols. And so this is what it looks like in an extract of text. Having said that, this strategy is on its way out in that region. In 2019, the Eastern Dan orthography developers decided unanimously to go over to representing with superscript diacritics. Several other languages have followed suit, and that has received government backing. Now, things start to warm up when we start to look at simultaneous featurality, where featurality coincides. 2 possibilities. One is that a single orthographic strategy may represent more than one feature and do so regularly throughout that entire series. So in the Ekokakung language in Namibia, the postposed letter H stands for aspiration of voiceless consonants, glottalization of voiced consonants, and breathiness of vowels. The other possibility is that a single series may systematically manifest more than one featural strategy. So the feature that I think is probably most likely to participate in this process is labialization. And in these 3 languages, in Sari, Chonga, and Moro, you can have it coinciding with prenasalization, lateralization, and rhoticization. And then if you want a real featural feast, you can do no better than go to the Kalahari Desert. The click languages of Southern Africa are extraordinarily, well, first of all, they have extraordinarily dense phoneme inventories. These are just the clicks. There's an entire separate table of consonants that aren't clicks as well. But you can see here, you've got 5 levels, 5 places of articulation for clicks: bilabial, dental, lateral, alveolar, and palatal, and then up to 19 possible secondary articulations that those combine with. And so I've highlighted the bilabial set here just so you can see what's going on. And all the bilabial clicks are represented with a circle with a dot in them. That's on the horizontal level, but if we look at the vertical patterns then in the same table, we see that all the secondary clicks that are uvular are represented with a postposed letter Q. And so the degree of featurality in these orthographies is particularly dense, particularly complex, and actually very, very regular. But if you want to explore it any further, you better get down there quick. This language has a few dozen speakers left. It's moribund, and there's probably not much literacy going on in this language. Well, now, one of the best ways of appreciating regularity in any system is to compare it against cases that don't meet up to that standard of regularity. And irregularity is probably just as common in Africa as regular featurality. Let's have a look at a few cases. One possibility is that an orthographic strategy may regularly represent a particular feature, but it's also used irregularly for a mixed bag of other unrelated purposes. So in these 5 languages, you've got the same strategy of a postposed letter H for implosives, ejectives, dentals, aspiration, and velarization. And that's great. It does so very regularly within those features. But then, in addition to that, the same strategy is used for other unrelated purposes. So the letter H does not always stand for what you think it might do. Another possibility is then that a featurality may be partially applied to a series, but it doesn't extend to the whole set. So in 3 languages of Sudan, we have plus ATR, advanced tongue root, being represented with a postposed letter X. It's quite unusual. And it doesn't quite do it regularly because there's one of them that doesn't get this treatment. And there's linguistic reasons for that, but the point being that it's not entirely regular. Let's have a look at 2 cases in Cameroon and compare irregularity with regularity. In Umfunte, the labial set of pre-nasalized consonants are all marked with the preposed letter M, so that's fine. But all the ones that aren't labial are marked with a preposed letter N. And the problem with that is that in feature geometry, minus labial is not a natural class of sounds because it includes dentals, coronals, velars, glottals, palatals, the whole mixed bag. So although the N marks nasality, it doesn't effectively mark place of articulation as well. Compare that with Nguni, where everything that's labial is M, everything that's coronal is N, and everything that's dorsal is Ng. So that's pure featurality. So I want to summarize by looking at non-click consonants, and actually we see quite a complex pattern emerge because you've got over a dozen features that may be represented in different orthographies across the continent, but lots of different strategies as well. So you've got to decide, are you going to add a preposed or a postposed symbol? Is it going to be an apostrophe or a letter? If it's a letter, should it be a consonant or a vowel? And if it's a consonant, should it be a monograph or a digraph? It's not an easy picture to see what's going on. But actually, I want to suggest that it's simpler than it looks. Because if you exclude any strategies that are actually very geographically limited, like the postposed letter X in Sudan in 3 languages to mark ATR vowels. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the continent. It's quite distinctive to that little area of Sudan. And if you exclude strategies that are kind of obvious, I mean, how are you going to mark roticization if it's not with a letter R? Then once you've swept those away, you've only got 2 remaining strategies, and that is a postposed letter H and an apostrophe, which may be preposed or postposed, and those used for multiple purposes then. And I want to end just by comparing linear and multilinear featural strategies, because I've done a separate parallel study of multilinear featurality, which has been submitted for publication elsewhere. And it's interesting to compare the 2. So with linear featurality, quite a narrow range of frequently used symbols that are deemed appropriate for these new emerging orthographies. It's going to be much more frequently applied to consonants and much less so to vowels, hardly ever to tone, only in that one region in Côte d'Ivoire, where actually it's on the way out anyway. And much less clearer areal tendencies than we find for multilinear featurality, where with multilinear strategies, we've got certain practices that are distinct to one country. So those you'll have to find out about in the other paper. And thank you for listening. Questions?
Could you just say a bit about why the X was used for the ATR? That was so unusual.
It is really unusual, yeah. I don't know much about the background, but looking at the multilinear paper, I found across the continent 13 different strategies being used for representing ATR.
Is it because H is used for something else, so it's closest thing?
I have to say I can't remember. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. It's probably the H's are probably being used for something like affricates, ch, sh, ch.
And it could be that the X is just not used in the language otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's certainly
Sure.
true. That's certainly the case.
But then
Yeah.
stands in for what the H is used.
Yeah, yeah. But ATR is extremely common across Africa in hundreds of languages. And most often in the area I'm living in, it's going to be marked with IPA special characters. So the minus ATR setter, E, or O, we just use the API characters and everybody's happy with that. It's not a problem. You go to other places and it's going to be with diacritics. Senegal uses a acute accent. Southern Nigeria uses a subscript dot. There's a lot more debate about whether that is really a good strategy. I would go for special characters every time.
Yes.
I'm thinking of an example of linear featurality in European languages. Would it include the Russian soft sign?
I don't know Russian.
Yeah.
With the French nasality is a classic example. The postposed letter N to represent nasality. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, to add to that question, in Irish, for the addition, they used to have a dot of letters, but these days they go for H as a linear featurality.
To mark what?
Lynching.
Okay, right. Hmm.
I have a question. So you said these were proposals. You don't know if they are actually used or adopted. Do you have any feedback on evolution? Have some of these systems evolved over time?
Well, I won't say that I don't know. I know for a lot of them whether they're being used or not, and I know for a lot of them whether they're just proposals, but there's a batch in the middle that I don't know about. Over time, there is orthography reform, but you know, things do get set in concrete. I mean, if you look at the case in southern Nigeria, where ATR is marked with a subscript dot in multiple languages. That emerged from Yoruba, and the Yoruba are fiercely proud of their orthographic strategy, partly because it was invented by a Yoruba man, not by an expatriate, Archbishop Crowther in the late 1800s. So they're not about to let go of that, no matter how effective or ineffective it is. And then that spread to multiple languages across Nigeria as well.